I've always been the type to give people the benefit of the doubt. It's probably what made me such a good fit for my career. 20 years in the fire department, plenty of chaos, but you learn to trust the team around you. And with my wife, Jessica, it was easy. We've been married almost 20 years, and I never once had a reason to doubt her. Jessica was one of those people who could make friends with a stranger in 5 minutes flat. Charismatic, quick with a laugh, and, I'll admit, easy on the eyes. She was everything you'd want in a partner. We had a good life together, too. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable. Our house was nothing fancy, but it was ours. Over the years, we'd built up a life I thought was rock solid. But recently, something fell off. Maybe it was just a small shift at first, things you wouldn't think twice about. She'd forget where she'd been a few days ago, or fumble details about who she was with. A few times, she seemed to mix up her story, telling me she was out with one friend when she'd already said she was with someone else. Nothing major, but enough for me to take note. I figured it was just stress. She worked as a paralegal at a firm downtown, and they'd been slammed with cases. Or so she told me. She'd come home talking about all the new clients, the late hours, and the pressure from her boss. And I believed her. I had no reason not to. One night, I got a small hint that maybe I wasn't the only one noticing these odd changes. We were out at dinner with some old friends, and Jessica was her usual charming self, talking about the cases her firm was handling and laughing at everyone's jokes. But her phone kept lighting up on the table, and each time, she'd flip it over without even checking who it was. After a while, my buddy Mike nudged me and nodded toward her phone. "Guess Jessica's popular tonight," he said, laughing a little. I chuckled back, but something about it bothered me. Why was she ignoring her phone so deliberately? On the drive home, I asked her about it, casual, like I wasn't even all that interested. "Who was blowing up your phone all night?" She shrugged, too quickly. "Just work stuff." One of the interns was asking about a case. That seemed like an odd answer, considering it was well after hours. But I let it go. No sense stirring up trouble over something small. Over the next few weeks, though, these little things started stacking up. She began taking her phone everywhere with her. Into the bathroom, out to the garage, even to the mailbox. And I noticed she kept it on silent all the time now. She'd always kept it loud before, with a chime for every little notification. When I asked her why she switched it to silent, she shrugged it off, saying the notifications were just too distracting. Still, that wasn't Jessica. She was the type who loved knowing everything that was going on, every email, every update, every news alert. This new silent mode didn't seem like her at all. Then one night, something happened that I couldn't ignore. It was a Wednesday night, one of those rare evenings where both of us had the time to just sit around, share some takeout, and catch up on a show. I was glad for it. It had been a long time since we'd had a quiet night in. Right around 9, Jessica's phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was on silent, as usual, but she must have forgotten to flip it over this time. I wasn't trying to snoop, but when the screen lit up, I caught a quick glimpse of the notification. It was a location ping, some sort of shared location update, which I thought was strange. We'd set up that feature a while back, mostly for practical reasons. But the location name struck me as odd. It was called Barnaby's Bar. Barnaby's Bar? I asked, trying to sound casual. Since when are you sharing locations for places like that? Jessica's eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite place before she laughed. A little too loud, a little too forced. "Oh, Barnaby's? That's just a place a couple of us stopped by after work one day last month. We were unwinding after a big case. It's nothing, really." I nodded, pretending to buy it, but my mind was already racing. Jessica wasn't really the grab-a-drink-after-work type, and she'd never mentioned this place before. I decided not to press her right then. I didn't want to come off as paranoid. But I tucked that little detail away. The next morning, curiosity got the better of me. Jessica had left early, saying she had a breakfast meeting with a client, and I figured I had a good half hour to kill before I needed to head out myself. So, I grabbed my laptop and looked up Barnaby's Bar. It wasn't too far from her office, a 10-minute walk, give or take. But what caught my eye was that it wasn't exactly the kind of place you'd go to unwind after a day at the office. It looked almost like a dive. Dim lighting, a few pool tables, and not much else. A little rough around the edges for Jessica. Or so I thought. I shrugged it off, telling myself I was overthinking. After all, maybe she just needed a break from the office. But something kept nagging at me. A couple of days later, We were at a neighborhood get-together. Jessica was in her element, laughing, chatting, playing hostess like she always did. But when I looked a little closer, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. She'd casually slipped off to the side of the yard with her phone. I watched from a distance as she checked something on her screen, a small smile on her face. And then I saw her send a text. She looked up, caught my gaze, and quickly slipped her phone in her pocket, laughing it off as she walked back toward the group. The next morning, I decided to go for a drive. Just a casual, aimless drive, I told myself, one that just happened to lead me near Barnaby's bar. I figured it would be closed in the early morning, and I was right, it was. But something about seeing it in person just made it all the more real, more suspicious. I parked across the street, staring at the place for a while, wondering if I was just losing it. Right as I was about to drive off, a familiar voice popped into my head. If you've got a question, find the answer yourself. It was advice my old fire captain used to give, and it had never steered me wrong. So, I decided to make a plan. The following Monday, I set my plan in motion. It was simple enough. I'd head into work like normal, but I'd swing by Jessica's office around lunchtime. Nothing too obvious, just to drop in to say hi, maybe take her out for lunch if she was free. And if she wasn't, well, I'd see where she was, wouldn't I? The morning crawled by. My mind kept going over all the little things I'd noticed, wondering if I was reading too much into them or if Jessica was genuinely hiding something. By noon, I was practically itching to get out of the office. I grabbed my keys, told my assistant I'd be back in a bit, and headed downtown toward Jessica's building. But just as I was about to leave the parking garage, my phone buzzed. I looked down and saw a notification from my bank. Jessica had just made a purchase at a place called Le Chandelier. Le Chandelier wasn't her usual lunch spot. It was an upscale French bistro, known more for its wine list than for quick meals. This didn't sit right with me. Jessica didn't even like French food all that much, let alone fancy places in the middle of the day. I was in my car, hands on the wheel, weighing my options. I could ignore it, chalk it up to Jessica meeting a client. Or I could follow my gut and find out for myself. It wasn't a hard choice. I pulled up to Le Chandelier and parked a block away. I didn't want to risk her spotting my car right out front. When I walked inside, I felt a bit out of place. It was dimly lit, with soft music playing in the background, couples tucked away in booths, and a few business types scattered around. I glanced around, scanning the tables. And there she was, near the back. Jessica was sitting at a small table, her back turned toward me. She was with someone, a man I didn't recognize, sharply dressed, leaning in close, laughing at something she'd said. My stomach dropped. I ducked back, trying to stay out of view as I tried to process what I was seeing. She'd never mentioned this lunch meeting, and the way she was leaning toward him, the way she smiled, it didn't look like any business lunch I'd ever seen. But I had to stay calm. Jumping to conclusions would get me nowhere. Instead, I waited, watching from the shadow of the bar, hoping I'd misread the situation. After about 20 minutes, they both stood up. I quickly ducked behind a pillar, watching as Jessica and her lunch companion headed toward the door, laughing. They walked out together, and for a moment, I almost followed them. But something told me to hang back, to think this through. Once they left, I walked back to my car, still trying to wrap my head around what I'd just seen. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was business, and I'd just gotten myself all worked up over nothing. But that gut feeling wouldn't go away. I got back to my office, replaying the scene over and over in my mind. She had laughed like she used to laugh with me, and that realization hurt more than I cared to admit. Later that evening, as I sat in my car in our driveway, I couldn't bring myself to go inside just yet. I was turning over my next move when I noticed something odd. Stuck under the windshield wiper of my car was a plain white envelope. I reached out and pulled it off, my heart pounding as I ripped it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message typed in neat, simple font. Watch her closely. There's more going on than you know. I stared at the note, my mind reeling. Someone knew about Jessica, about what I was only just starting to suspect. Who would send me this? Why not confront me directly? There were more questions than answers, but one thing was clear. I couldn't ignore this. Whoever sent this note knew something, and I was going to find out what it was. And if Jessica was hiding something from me, I'd get to the bottom of it. I tucked the note in my jacket and headed inside, the the weight of it pressing on me with each step. After finding that note on my windshield, I knew I couldn't sit back anymore. Somebody wanted me to know something, and if Jessica was hiding things, it was time I found out. The next day, I put my plan into action. I called up an old friend from my fire department days, Joe, who now works security for a local investigation firm. Joe wasn't exactly a private investigator, but he had enough know-how to get me what I needed, the basic tools to track Jessica without raising suspicion. After a few beers, he passed me a small recording device and a discreet GPS tracker. I'd always felt like privacy was sacred between a husband and wife, but I wasn't the same husband I was a few weeks ago. After everything I'd seen, I had to know the truth, even if it meant crossing lines I never thought I'd cross. That night, Jessica was in the shower, so I took my chance. Her car keys were on the kitchen counter, and I slipped the tracker into a small pocket on her keychain. Easy to overlook, and she'd never think twice about it. As I held those keys in my hand, I felt a mix of dread and relief. Dread at what I might find, but relief at finally taking action. The next day, I checked the GPS app on my phone during lunch. Jessica was at her office, right where she was supposed to be. But as the day wore on, she made a strange detour on her way home, stopping for about an hour at a location I didn't recognize. I looked it up, a coffee shop, nothing out of the ordinary. But something about it didn't sit right with me. If she wanted a coffee, she'd usually go to the place closer to her work. This stop didn't make sense. I kept watching the tracker every day that week, and each time, she made these little detours. It wasn't every day, but often enough that I couldn't brush it off as coincidence. The coffee shop, a bookstore in another part of town, even an art gallery she'd never once mentioned to me. Each place seemed like it was carefully chosen, places that wouldn't raise suspicion unless someone was watching. But that was the thing, she didn't know someone was watching. Finally, by Friday, I couldn't keep this bottled up anymore. I needed more than just dots on a map. I needed proof. So, I decided to go through her phone. Now, I knew this was dangerous territory, but I'd reached my breaking point. That night, I waited until she was asleep. Jessica always had a heavy sleep after a long week, so I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake her, and took her phone from the nightstand. My heart was pounding as I tapped in her password. She hadn't changed it, which felt like a small relief. As I went through her texts, everything looked normal at first. Just conversations with friends, her family, even our kids. But then, I saw a message chain with someone named M. There was nothing explicit in the text, just vague references to meeting up and phrases like, "Looking forward to Tuesday and had a great time as always." I couldn't tell if M was a friend or something else, but the tone felt off. It didn't seem like something you'd say to a casual acquaintance. I jotted down the number, deciding I'd run it through Joe to see if he could give me more information. I put her phone back and lay there in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. I didn't know who M was, but I knew I was close. Closer than I'd ever been to figuring out what was going on. It was only a matter of time before I had all the answers. And when I did, there'd be no going back. By Saturday morning, I was a man on a mission. I took the number I'd found in Jessica's phone, and I gave Joe a call. He knew by my tone that this was serious, so he didn't ask too many questions. Just assured me he'd look into it and call me when he found anything. That weekend, I kept things casual with Jessica. We went through our usual routine, but every time I looked at her, my mind was spinning, wondering who M was and how he fit into her life. Jessica was as cheerful as ever, acting like everything was fine, which only made me more certain she was hiding something. She was a good liar, I had to give her that. By Sunday night, Joe had called me back with a lead. He'd run the number through a few databases, and it had come back registered to a Michael Perry, a real estate agent in town. I'd never heard of him, but Joe offered me the basic rundown. Married, mid-40s, no criminal record, and from the looks of it, a pretty successful guy. Just the kind of respectable man no one would ever suspect. "Think he's the guy?" Joe asked, his voice laced with concern. "It's got to be him," I said, feeling a strange mix of relief and anger. Finally, I had a name to match the suspicion that had been gnawing at me for weeks. Joe offered to do more digging, maybe give me an address or a schedule, but I thanked him and told him I'd handle it from here. I didn't know what I planned to do with this information yet, but I knew I had to confront this Michael character myself. If he was involved with my wife, I wanted him to look me in the eye and explain. On Monday, I drove over to Michael's real estate office. I didn't want to cause a scene, so I kept my distance, waiting in my car across the street. I just wanted to look at the man. I wanted to know who had been messaging my wife, and more importantly, I wanted to see what kind of guy I was dealing with. After about 20 minutes, a man stepped out of the office. Tall, dressed in a clean-cut suit, carrying himself with a confidence that rubbed me the wrong way. Even from a distance, I could tell he was the type who was used to getting what he wanted. I watched him walk to his car, all smooth and collected, like he didn't have a care in the world. I took a few deep breaths, forcing myself to stay calm. This was just reconnaissance. I wasn't about to blow my cover by confronting him now. That night, I went home and tried to act like nothing was wrong, but Jessica could tell I was distant. At one point, she asked if everything was okay, even touched my arm with that worried look I'd come to know so well. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Just work stuff." But inside, I was boiling. This Michael guy was out there, going about his life without a second thought for the family he was messing with. I spent most of the night lying awake, going over different scenarios, picturing the look on his face if he ever found out I knew everything. By midweek, I had a plan. Michael was going to an open house on Thursday afternoon, a property he was showcasing for some high-end clients. It was all public knowledge, listed right on his company's website. I figured I'd show up, pretend to be an interested buyer, and see what I could learn. That Thursday, I got dressed up, put on a collared shirt and my best poker face, and headed over to the open house. As I stepped inside, I felt a strange mix of nerves and anger. There he was, smooth-talking a group of potential buyers, flashing that same polished smile I'd seen from across the street. He spotted me in the crowd and came over, extending his hand with that salesman charm. "Welcome, Michael Perry. Nice to meet you." I forced a smile, shaking his hand. "Mark Johnson," I said, using my middle name for safety's sake. "I heard about this place and thought I'd take a look." He nodded, clearly pleased. "Great. It's a beautiful property, perfect for families or someone looking to settle down." The irony wasn't lost on me, but I kept my mouth shut and let him give me the tour, nodding along as he pointed out the kitchen's marble countertops and the spacious backyard. I played my part, asking questions and acting impressed. But the whole time, I watched him closely, looking for any sign of guilt, anything that would tell me he knew I was onto him. At one point, he mentioned something about family life, and I had to bite my tongue to keep from saying anything. He had no idea who I was or why I was there, and somehow, that made it all the more satisfying. As I left, I glanced back at him one last time, filing away every detail. He had no clue the storm that was coming his way, but he would. Soon enough, he'd know exactly who he was dealing with. Back at home, I felt a strange sense of calm. I finally had a name, a face, and enough proof to confront Jessica. And after all these weeks of doubt, I was ready for whatever came next. This was only the beginning, and for once, I felt like I was the one in control. The next few days felt like a waiting game. I kept replaying every moment I'd spent watching Michael in my head, every word he'd said, every smile he'd given me, unaware I was the husband of the woman he was messaging behind my back. The more I thought about it, the more it felt like a challenge. Michael, with his perfect suit and polished words, acting like he was above it all, like he could get away with whatever he wanted. But it was Jessica's face that haunted me the most. That cheerful, casual smile she'd given me every day, acting like everything was fine, like I was the only man in her life. I'd catch myself glancing over at her during dinner, my mind spinning with everything I'd learned, wondering how long she'd been playing me for a fool. On Sunday, she announced she'd be meeting up with Becca for lunch, a friend I knew she'd been lying about seeing before. I knew what this meant. She was going to see Michael. So, I decided to follow her. She left around 11, texting someone just before heading out the door. I gave her a good 5-minute head start before grabbing my keys and driving in the same direction. I was careful, staying a few cars behind, watching as she drove toward the edge of town. Just when I thought she was about to head somewhere obvious, she turned onto a winding road that led to the outskirts, far from any restaurant or lunch spot. Eventually, she pulled into a small park, the kind that was almost hidden from the main road. I parked at a distance, waiting to see what she'd do. A few minutes later, a black car pulled up next to her, and I knew it had to be him. My fists clenched as I watched Jessica step out of her car, looking around to make sure no one else was around. Then, Michael stepped out of his car, and they met just between the two vehicles. I took out my phone, my hands shaking as I hit record, catching them in a quick embrace. They kept it brief, just a hug, a casual touch, but it was enough. She leaned into him, looking up at him with that smile I'd thought was just for me. For years, I thought we shared something special, something that could weather anything. But as I sat there, watching her lean on another man, I felt that last bit of faith crumble. They sat down at a bench nearby, talking and laughing, oblivious to the world around them. I couldn't hear them, but from the way they acted, I could see that this was routine for them. It wasn't a fling. This was something deeper. I drove home, barely remembering the trip. My mind was on autopilot, playing back the scene over and over. There was no denying it now, no way to justify it as just a misunderstanding. Jessica was betraying me, and it was clear she wasn't planning on stopping anytime soon. Back at the house, I went straight to the garage. I needed a moment to breathe, to think without her presence clouding my thoughts. As I stood there, hands clenched on my workbench, a plan began to form in my mind. I couldn't just confront her. Not yet. I wanted her to feel the weight of what she'd done, to see just how deep she'd cut into our life together. I spent the rest of the day setting things up. First, I copied the video to a private drive, one she wouldn't be able to find. Then, I combed through our joint bank account, pulling every record of strange transactions, noting each one that seemed off, each one I knew she'd hidden from me. A few purchases stood out: a hotel near Michael's office, a restaurant I'd never heard of, a jewelry shop receipt I knew wasn't for anything I'd received. As the list grew, so did my resolve. I wasn't just going to confront her. I was going to make sure she felt every ounce of betrayal she'd caused. When she got home that evening, she looked at me with that easy, casual smile and asked if I'd had a good day. I forced a smile, nodding, playing my part, but inside, I was seething. Let her think everything's fine, I thought. Let her keep smiling, keep lying. Soon enough, she'd know the truth. As I lay in bed that night, my plan started to fall into place. The confrontation was coming, but it was going to be on my terms, in my way. And when the time came, she wouldn't know what hit her. The next morning, I woke up with a clearer head and a sense of purpose. I had a plan, and all I needed now was to keep gathering proof. Jessica had lied to me, over and over, and I wanted to make sure that when the moment came, she wouldn't be able to deny a thing. I started with the bank statements. I'd always handled the finances, so I had easy access to all our records, and I went back a full year. There, I found every suspicious transaction that had slipped by me before: the dinners, the hotels, and, as it turned out, even a weekend getaway. Each one was marked by a specific date, a place, an amount. It was all there in black and white. One particular charge stood out: a high-end hotel about an hour outside of town, a place Jessica and I had talked about visiting but had never actually gone to. She'd stayed there just last month, and judging by the price of the room, she hadn't been alone. My hands shook as I printed out each receipt, each charge, adding them to the growing pile of evidence. After lunch, I decided to check her work schedule against her so-called client dinners and late nights. Jessica had a work laptop that she'd left open on the counter one evening, and I had noticed that her email automatically signed in whenever the screen woke up. I waited until she was busy in the garage, then opened her work calendar and scrolled through the last few months. What I found was exactly what I'd expected: blank spots on nights she claimed she was working, conveniently left empty or marked with vague, out-of-office notations. Each time she had gone out to see Michael, she deliberately left her schedule blank, no explanations, no details. She'd taken time off and simply neglected to mention it, probably hoping I'd never bother to look. But now I had the full picture. Later that night, I decided to take a risk. I logged into her phone account online, using our shared account information, looking to see if I could find anything concrete. And there it was, her call log, all laid out in neat rows. Her last call to Michael had been just that afternoon. Not only that, but there were hundreds of calls and texts between them over the last few months, at all hours. It wasn't just the quantity. It was the timing that told me everything. They'd talk late at night, sometimes early in the morning, and on days when she was supposedly busy with work. I took screenshots of the messages and downloaded her call logs, saving copies onto the drive. With all of this in place, I had enough proof to confront her. But now, a new idea started forming in my mind, one that went beyond a simple confrontation. I wanted her to feel the weight of every lie, to make her face not only me, but everyone she'd betrayed along the way. The next day, I started looking into her social media accounts. Jessica had a public-facing side that she kept spotless, a profile filled with family photos, work events, and pictures of us on vacations. She painted the picture-perfect image of a loyal wife and dedicated professional. But I knew it was all a front now, and part of me wanted to shatter that image as publicly as she'd shattered my trust. While Jessica was in the shower, I drafted an email to Michael's wife. I'd met her only once at a neighborhood barbecue years back, but I remembered her being kind, laughing at all of Michael's jokes like she had no idea who her husband really was. I didn't plan to send it yet, but the draft was ready, with every attachment of evidence I had gathered, so that when the time came, she'd know everything too. By the end of the week, I had everything in place. I was ready to lay out each lie, every betrayal, and make her answer for it all. But I wanted the right moment. Jessica thought she'd cover her tracks, but she had no idea I was one step ahead of her. She would find out soon enough. By Friday, I was ready. I'd spent the whole week collecting and organizing the evidence, triple-checking every screenshot, every receipt, every call log. I wanted Jessica to see everything in black and white, each piece of proof laid out for her with no chance to wiggle out or twist the story. But more than that, I wanted to confront her in a way that left her with no escape, no easy way to play innocent. So I planned out each step, rehearsed what I'd say, and finally decided on a setting she'd never see coming. Our anniversary was on Sunday, and she'd made some comment about wanting to go out to celebrate. It was perfect, really. The last chance for her to pretend everything was fine, to play the role of the loving wife before the truth came crashing down. So I told her I'd planned something special, a surprise for just the two of us. I could see her eyes light up, like she thought I'd forgotten our anniversary or that I was about to shower her with some grand romantic gesture. I almost laughed at the irony, but I kept my face straight and assured her it would be a night to remember. Sunday arrived, and I spent the day putting everything in place. I'd made a reservation at a cozy Italian restaurant we both loved. The staff knew us well. We'd gone there every anniversary for years, and they'd always saved us a booth in the back where we could talk and relax. It was the last place she'd expect me to confront her, and I knew that once we sat down, she'd be trapped. No excuses, no exits. That afternoon, as she got ready, I watched her from the corner of my eye. She was carefully putting on makeup, doing her hair, choosing her outfit with a bit more care than usual. I couldn't help but wonder if she was planning to see Michael afterward, like she had so many times before. The thought made my stomach turn, but it only strengthened my resolve. By the time we got to the restaurant, I convinced myself that this was the right way. I was calm, more calm than I'd felt in weeks. And as we slid into our usual booth, I felt a strange satisfaction settle over me. Jessica seemed at ease, laughing and chatting, looking around like she was genuinely happy to be there. But I knew better. I waited until we'd ordered, letting her talk about her day, her week, all the usual small talk. She was in good spirits, smiling, completely unaware of what was coming. As she rambled on about some friend's new job, I finally decided it was time. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the first stack of evidence, the hotel receipts, the bank statements, and printed messages between her and Michael. I laid them out in front of her, one by one, letting her see each piece in the quiet, candlelit setting of our favorite booth. Her smile froze, her hand halfway to her glass. She stared at the papers, her eyes widening as she began to understand what she was looking at. What is this?" she whispered, her voice shaking. I leaned forward, keeping my tone low but steady. "You tell me, Jessica. You've been meeting Michael for months now. Late nights, weekends, business trips that never added up. I've got the proof right here, and I want to hear you admit it." She looked up at me, eyes darting around the room like she was searching for an exit. I, I don't know what you're talking about, she stammered, but her face betrayed her. The color had drained from her cheeks, her lips tight as she struggled to keep her composure. I slid another sheet toward her, one with their call logs, showing hundreds of messages and calls exchanged at all hours. Still want to deny it? I asked, my voice low and cold. For a moment, she was silent, staring down at the paper, hands clenched on the table. Finally, she took a shaky breath and looked up, trying to muster some of that charm she'd always used to disarm me. Mark, listen. I can explain. Don't. I cut her off, my tone sharper than I intended. Don't sit here and pretend you can explain your way out of this. I've been watching you, Jessica. I've seen you with him. I know exactly who you are. Her eyes filled with tears, but for once, I didn't feel the slightest bit of sympathy. She'd been lying to me for so long, betraying our life together, and I could see now that every tear, every look of guilt, was just another act. After a long silence, she finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. How did you find out? I sat back, letting the weight of the question sink in. I trusted you, I said simply. And you took advantage of that trust every chance you got. You thought you'd never get caught, that I'd never suspect. But here we are. Jessica looked down, her shoulders slumping as the reality of her situation settled over her. I watched as she realized there was no way out, no way to spin this in her favor. But this was only the beginning. I wanted her to feel what it was like to lose everything, just as she'd made me feel. And before we left that night, she'd know exactly what was coming next. Jessica sat across from me in stunned silence, still pale, her fingers trembling as she stared down at the pile of evidence in front of her. I could tell she was scrambling for something to say, some excuse that might claw back control of the situation, but I wasn't about to let her off that easily. Let me ask you something, I said, leaning forward, keeping my voice just above a whisper. What was the plan? Was it just a fling? Or were you planning on leaving? She looked up, her face a mixture of guilt and desperation. Mark, it's not what you think, she began, but her words sounded hollow even to her. She knew she'd been caught, and every excuse she could come up with only served to dig her deeper. Not what I think, I replied, scoffing. I think you were lying to me for months. I think you found it easy to go around behind my back, thinking I'd never notice. And from what I can see here, I was just another item on your schedule. A backup plan in case this little affair with Michael didn't work out. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face, but I didn't stop. You took what we had, Jessica. Every year, every memory, everything we built together, and you threw it away. And now, you're going to deal with the consequences. Jessica looked up at me, the realization dawning in her eyes. What do you mean? I reached into my pocket and pulled out the draft email I'd printed, the one with her entire affair detailed in black and white, each piece of evidence attached. This, I said, sliding it across the table, is the email I've written to Michael's wife. I haven't sent it yet, but if I do, she'll know every last detail. Her eyes widened, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Mark, please don't do this. She doesn't need to know. You mean the way I didn't need to know? I shot back. I've been living a lie because of you. And now you want me to spare her the same pain? She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She looked down at the email draft, her shoulders sagging as the weight of her betrayal finally seemed to sink in. But that's not all, I continued. I've also compiled a full report of your affair, dates, places, everything, complete with all your work absences and discrepancies. I paused, savoring the shock on her face. I wonder what your boss would think if he saw this. Jessica's hands clenched into fists. You couldn't. That would ruin everything I've worked for. Everything you've worked for? I said, my voice rising despite myself. I was working for us, for a life we could share. And meanwhile, you were working to throw it all away, piece by piece, lie by lie. Her face twisted, her earlier defiance crumbling as she began to realize the full extent of what was happening. Mark, I'm begging you. Please don't do this. I'll end things with Michael. I'll do anything. Just don't ruin my career. Don't tear apart my life. For a moment, I felt a pang of something close to pity. But it faded just as quickly, replaced by the anger and betrayal that had been festering inside me since this whole thing began. You already tore apart our life, Jessica. You're the one who did this, not me. I gathered the documents and slid them back into my jacket pocket. I just made sure there would be consequences. We sat in silence, her face frozen in disbelief, the last remnants of her bravado gone. She looked as lost as I had felt, and for once, she had no answers, no quick charm to cover the lies. Here's what's going to happen. I continued, my tone steady. You're going to tell me everything, the full truth, no more lies, no more half answers. Every detail of your little affair. And then, we're going to figure out how to end this properly. She nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, her gaze locked on the table. I could tell she had no fight left. All she had was the bare truth, and it was clear that admitting it would be as painful for her as hearing it had been for me. In that quiet moment, I realized that, for the first time in months, I was finally in control. Jessica's lies, her secrets, her hidden life, they were all mine now, and I was going to make sure she understood the cost of every one. Jessica sat across from me, her face pale and drawn, as though she'd aged years in just a few minutes. The restaurant felt quiet, as if the whole place was holding its breath, waiting to see how this confrontation would end. Start talking, I said, my voice steady. I want to know everything, and if I catch you lying again, there'll be no more mercy from me. Understand? She nodded, her gaze fixed on the table, and after a long, tense silence, she began to speak. It started a few months ago, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Michael and I, we ran into each other at an office mixer. He showed interest, and I was flattered. At first, it was nothing, just conversations, just a friendship. I felt a fresh wave of anger rising, but kept my voice level. And when did it turn into more than that? Jessica closed her eyes, as if trying to block out the memory. It wasn't long. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't stop. He made me feel alive, Mark. I don't know why I let it go so far, but it did. Alive? I repeated, trying to keep my temper in check. So, our life together was dead to you? She shook her head, a few tears falling. No, Mark, it wasn't like that. I was stupid. I didn't think I'd get caught up in something like this. But then it took on a life of its own. I leaned back, watching her as she struggled with her words. It was like watching a stranger, someone I thought I knew but clearly didn't. The woman I'd married had become someone I couldn't even recognize. Why? I finally asked, my voice soft. Why betray me after everything we built together? Jessica wiped her tears, struggling to keep herself composed. I don't know. I guess I wanted to feel like I had choices, like I wasn't just Mark's wife, stuck in a routine. I thought it was harmless at first, but it became an escape, and then I couldn't stop. Her words hung in the air, twisting like a knife. The life we'd shared, the future I'd thought we were building together, it had all been shattered by this desire of hers to feel alive. I took a deep breath, collected my thoughts. So, all this sneaking around, the lies, the client dinners, that was just you and Michael, enjoying your little escape? She nodded, her face a mask of shame. Yes, I'm so sorry, Mark. I don't expect you to forgive me. I know I don't deserve that. I know I've destroyed everything. For a moment, a heavy silence settled between us. The Jessica I'd once loved felt like a distant memory, replaced by this person who had thought so little of what we'd built that she was willing to throw it away for some cheap thrill. Do you love him? I asked, almost surprising myself with the question. Jessica hesitated, then shook her head slowly. No, I don't. It wasn't about love, it was never about that. It was a stupid, reckless mistake, and now I'm losing everything because of it. I watched her, the person I'd once thought I'd grow old with, and I felt a strange sense of calm. I'd spent weeks tearing myself apart, trying to understand her betrayal, and now that I had the truth, it no longer mattered. Here's what's going to happen, I said, keeping my voice level. We're done. This marriage, it's over. Jessica nodded, tears streaming down her face, but she didn't protest. I could see that she'd finally understood the full weight of what she'd done. We'll settle everything as peacefully as possible, I continued. I'll get a lawyer. and I'll make sure this divorce goes through smoothly. But make no mistake, you've lost my trust, my respect, and any chance of me helping you protect your career or reputation. If Michael's wife finds out, that's on you." Jessica's head hung low, and I could see the guilt and regret etched into her face. But I knew that her apologies and tears wouldn't undo the damage she'd caused. They couldn't bring back the life we'd lost, the future I'd once imagined with her. We left the restaurant separately that night. I drove home alone, a strange sense of calm washing over me. The anger, the betrayal, the hurt, it was still there, but it felt distant now, like a weight had finally been lifted. In the days that followed, we started the legal process. Jessica tried to reach out a few times, leaving messages and apologizing again, but I never responded. I needed the distance, the space to rebuild my life on my terms. A few weeks later, I ran into Joe, my friend from the security firm, who'd helped me gather evidence. He asked me how things had turned out, and I filled him in on the basics, leaving out the messier details. "Well," Joe said with a nod, "sounds like you handled it better than most people would. Clean break. Smart move." "Yeah," I replied, realizing how true that felt. "It's hard, but I'm moving forward, one step at a time." Over the next few months, I slowly started piecing my life back together. I focused on work, picked up some new hobbies, even reconnected with a few old friends I hadn't seen in years. It wasn't easy, but each day felt a little bit better than the last. And as for Jessica, I didn't keep tabs on her, didn't need to. We'd made our final split, and I was done with her drama, her lies, and everything she'd taken from me. I had my own life to focus on, and I wasn't going to waste another minute looking back. If there's anything I've learned from all of this, it's that people can surprise you in ways you'd never expect. Sometimes, the people you trust the most are the ones who hurt you the deepest. But moving on, finding that strength within yourself, that's what matters. I don't know what the future holds, but for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm finally ready for it. And I'll tell you this much, I'm never letting anyone take advantage of me like that again.